The night my husband grabbed his ex's hand and smiled at his mother, I didn't cry. I didn't beg, because my bags were already in the car. If that sentence just made your jaw drop, stay with me, because this story is not about heartbreak. It's about a woman who finally chose herself, and the moment everything changed forever. If you've ever loved someone who took you for granted, hit that like button right now and subscribe. You're going to want to be here for this. My name is Celeste, and for a long time, I believed I had the life I'd always dreamed of. I grew up in a small house with big love. My mother worked double shifts at a hospital laundry room so my sister and I could have clean uniforms for school. We didn't have much, but we had pride, we had standards, and my mother drilled one thing into me from the time I was old enough to understand. Build something of your own, baby, something nobody can take from you. So I did. I put myself through design school, slept on a borrowed mattress in a one-room apartment, and spent every spare hour learning the craft of interior architecture. By the time I was 31, I had my own studio. Small at first, just me, a drafting table, and a second-hand laptop, but it was mine. Every single corner of it was mine. That's the version of me Daniel met. He walked into a gallery opening where I designed the space. Warm amber lighting, exposed bricks softened with botanical installations, the kind of room that made people slow down without knowing why. He said, "I don't know who designed this place, but they understand something most people don't." Then he turned around and there I was. He smiled like he found something he didn't know he was looking for. We dated for 2 years. He was warm then, attentive. He'd drive 40 minutes just to bring me dinner when I was working late. He wrote me letters, actual handwritten letters on his hotel company stationery. I still have one of them in a box somewhere. I haven't opened it in a long time. We got married on a Saturday in September. The light was golden, the music was everything, and I wore my grandmother's earrings. I thought I was stepping into the most beautiful chapter of my life. I didn't yet know that someone had already decided I didn't belong in it. Daniel's mother, Dorothea, was the kind of woman who smiled while she cut you. She never raised her voice, she never said anything outright cruel, but she had a gift, a real practiced gift for making you feel like a stain on an otherwise clean tablecloth. The first time I wore my hair in locks to one of her dinners, she looked at me for a long moment and said, "How adventurous." Nothing more, just those 2 words, delivered with that smile in front of 7 people. Daniel squeezed my hand under the table, and I told myself it meant nothing. She questioned my background in ways that sounded like curiosity. She'd ask about my mother's work with just enough pause before the word work to make it feel like a small wound. When I talked about my studio, she'd nod slowly and say things like, "That's lovely, dear, a little creative venture." A little creative venture. My blood, my sacrifice, my mother's double shifts, a little creative venture. And Daniel would laugh softly and change the subject, every single time. I told myself he was keeping the peace. I told myself he loved me and that love was enough of a shield. I was wrong about both things. The first time I heard Lydia's name, we'd been married for about 8 months. Daniel mentioned her the way you mention someone you assume your partner already knows, casually, without weight. Lydia always said that restaurant was overrated. I looked up from my plate and said, "Who's Lydia?" He explained, college girlfriend, stayed friends, completely harmless. I noted the name and let it go. But names have a way of returning, don't they? Lydia came up again, then again. She'd come up in stories Daniel told his mother, and I'd watch Dorothea's entire face light up like a window with the curtain pulled back. She'd say things like, "Lydia is such a thoughtful girl," or, "Lydia sent me flowers on my birthday." Then she'd look at me, just a glance, just a half second, and that was enough. I started paying attention, and the more I paid attention, the more I understood that something was being built around me that I hadn't agreed to be part of. The dinner that broke something open in me happened on a Friday evening in early spring. Dorothea had invited what she called close family and a few dear friends. I made jollof rice, my grandmother's recipe, slow-cooked, the kind that fills a room with something warm and real. I brought it as a gesture, as an offering, honestly. I was still trying. Lord knows I was still trying. Dorothea thanked me, set the dish on the far end of the table, and never mentioned it again all evening. Nobody served it until I quietly spooned some onto my own plate. And then Lydia arrived. I want you to understand, nobody told me she was coming. Not Dorothea, not Daniel. He shrugged and said, I thought Mom mentioned it. She hadn't. I would have remembered. Lydia was polished, pleasant, and clearly had no idea what she'd walked into. But Dorothea transformed the moment Lydia stepped through that door. She stood up, she hugged her long and close. She pulled out the chair beside her, the one that had been empty all evening, the one I'd assumed was for a late guest. She looked around the table with that smile and said, "This is the daughter I always wanted." The table laughed. People clinked glasses. I sat very still. I smiled because I had learned in that house that showing pain only gave people something to do with their hands. Daniel caught my eye from across the table. He looked away first. That night in the car, I said, "Your mother just told a room full of people she wishes Lydia was her daughter, while I was sitting right there." Daniel sighed. He said, "You're being sensitive. She's known Lydia for years. It wasn't about you." It wasn't about me, right. I looked out the window and said nothing more. But something shifted in me on that drive home. Something quiet and certain and irreversible. I didn't have a plan yet, but I felt the first stone of one being laid. Over the following weeks, I watched the pattern repeat itself in different costumes. Lydia at the birthday brunch, Lydia at the cousins get-together, Lydia's name in conversations like a thread being pulled through every piece of fabric in my marriage. And Daniel began to compare. Not always in words. Sometimes it was just the way he'd mention something she'd said, the way he'd brighten a little when her name came up, the way my achievements seemed to land flat in rooms where his family celebrated hers. My studio won a regional design award that month. I came home glowing. Daniel said, "That's great, babe," and went back to his phone. 3 days later, Lydia got promoted at the architectural firm where she worked, an irony I did not miss. And Daniel called his mother for 20 minutes, laughing, celebrating, saying, "She really deserves it." I stood in the kitchen doorway, and I thought, when did I become a background character in my own marriage? Then came the phone call, the one I was never supposed to hear. I'd come downstairs for water around midnight. Daniel was on the patio, voice low but clear through the cracked glass door. I heard my name first, which is what stopped my feet. And then I heard him say, "I know, Mom, I know. Lydia never made me feel like I had to explain myself, like I was walking a tightrope every time she was in the room." A pause. Then, "Maybe you were right from the beginning." I stood in the dark hallway for what felt like a very long time. I didn't cry. I think I was past the part of this where crying was available to me. I walked back upstairs, sat on the edge of the bed, and stared at the wall. And I thought about my mother, about what she built, about what she told me to build, about the note on my drafting table from my lawyer confirming the studio's new contract, a luxury hotel lobby redesign for a major regional chain, the biggest project of my career. I thought, I have been so busy trying to fit into his life that I almost forgot I had one. That night, I made a decision. I didn't tell Daniel, I didn't tell anyone. I just started planning. The planning took 2 weeks. I was calm the entire time. The kind of calm that comes not from peace, but from clarity. I called my lawyer, a brilliant woman named Sandra, and we began structuring the separation of finances. I protected the studio accounts, retrieved documents, moved everything that mattered to me legally and financially into a clean, separate space. I called Rochelle, my best friend since we were 16 years old, and told her everything. She cried. I didn't. She said, "Where are you going?" I said, "Somewhere I can breathe." I packed slowly across multiple evenings while Daniel worked late. I took what was mine and left everything we'd built together exactly as it was. I'm not a person who takes more than she's owed. And then Daniel announced the family weekend at Dorothea's countryside estate, one of those grand, stiff performance weekends that his family specialized in. Linen napkins, formal seating, conversations designed to remind you of the hierarchy. He told me on a Tuesday,
On Thursday evening, I packed my bags. On Friday morning, I loaded them into the trunk of my car before he woke up.
I drove to that estate with everything I owned that mattered to me sitting behind me, and I walked through those doors one last time with my head straight and my face open, and my heart already free. The weekend moved the way those weekends always did. Daniel was distracted, Dorothea was performing, and Lydia was there, already there when we arrived, greeted at the door like the prodigal daughter returning home. I was shown to a small room at the back of the house, the suites where I usually stayed. The one with the tall windows and the reading chair I loved was Lydia's room that weekend. Nobody explained it, nobody apologized. I set my handbag down on the narrow bed, and I looked out the small window, and I thought, yes, there it is, the truth of where you stand, finally, without disguise. I was pleasant all weekend. I complimented the garden. I helped clear the table. I laughed at the right moments. I was the most gracious version of a woman who had already left. Sunday lunch was when it happened. Dorothea stood at the head of the table with her glass raised. She gave one of her speeches, polished and warm, and designed to tell a particular story. She talked about family, about legacy, about the people who truly belong in our circle. And then she turned to Lydia, and her face did that thing, that full, unguarded, genuine opening that it never once did for me in 4 years of marriage. And she said, "Some connections are simply meant to be, no matter how long the detour." The table responded. Laughter, warmth, glasses raised, and Daniel, my husband, the man who had written me letters on stationery, the man who once drove 40 minutes with dinner because he didn't want me to eat alone, he reached across the table and took Lydia's hand. He smiled at his mother. He did not look at me. I sat with that for exactly 5 seconds. Then I folded my napkin into a neat square. I placed it beside my plate. I stood up and I said, "Excuse me, I need some air." Nobody stopped me. Nobody followed. I walked through that house for the last time, past the formal sitting room, past the portraits on the wall, past the vase Dorothea had once told me not to touch, out the front door, down the stone steps, across the gravel drive. I opened the trunk of my car. My bags were right where I'd left them. I got in, I started the engine, I pulled out of that driveway, and I did not look in the rearview mirror once. I called Rochelle. She picked up on the first ring. I said, "I'm on my way." She said, "I've got the kettle on." And that was enough. That was all I needed. What Daniel didn't know, what none of them knew, was that Sandra had filed the divorce papers that Friday afternoon, before I ever set foot in that estate. I had walked through the entire weekend as a free woman. Every polished smile, every cleared plate, every gracious laugh, it was all the closing chapter, not the crisis. I had already written my own ending before they finished writing their version of my story. Daniel called 27 times that evening. I know because I counted before I turned the phone over. Dorothea called 4 times. She left one voicemail, sharp, indignant, the mask finally fully off. She said I had embarrassed the family, that I was being dramatic, that I should come back and handle this like a grown woman. I listened to it once. Then I listened to it again, and then I called Daniel back, just once, because I believed he deserved one final sentence from me. When he answered, frantic, mid-sentence, I let him finish, and then I said, "I didn't embarrass anyone. I simply stopped pretending." I hung up. I blocked them both. He came home to an apartment that looked like me and didn't feel like me anymore. Half the shelves were bare. My drafting table was gone. My grandmother's ceramic bowl that sat by the front door, gone. And on the kitchen counter, my key, and a note in my handwriting. I deserved better. I finally believe it. I found out about Lydia's side of the story about 6 weeks later, through a mutual acquaintance, and I want to tell you because this part matters.
Lydia had nothing to do with what was done to me. She had actually tried, months before all of this, to reach out to me quietly. I hadn't known. The message had been filtered into a folder I never checked. She told our mutual friend she had been deeply uncomfortable with the way Dorothea used her, dangled her like a threat, elevated her like a weapon. She didn't want to be in that role. She was a pawn in someone else's game, not a player.
The evening of that Sunday lunch, after I left, Lydia apparently put down her glass, looked at Dorothea, and said, "I don't want to be part of this." She packed her own bag and drove home before dinner. The real architect of my pain had never been Lydia. It had been the woman at the head of the table, raising her glass, engineering the destruction of her son's marriage because it had never fit the picture she'd painted long before I arrived. Dorothea had decided who her son would end up with before he had a chance to decide for himself, and Daniel, sweet, cowardly, letters-on-stationery Daniel, had let her. In the months that followed, I worked. I designed the most beautiful hotel lobby I'd ever created, all warm stone and living walls and light that moved with the time of day. It was featured in a regional architecture magazine, full spread. My face on one side, the finished space on the other. I stood in that lobby in the photograph in a burnt orange wrap dress with my locks pinned up, and I looked, I am told, like a woman who owns the room. Because I did. Daniel saw the magazine. I know because Rochelle told me, and honestly, I'd be lying if I said I didn't feel something when I heard that. Not satisfaction exactly, something quieter, something like proof that I had never needed the table I'd been trying to earn a seat at. Dorothea, without Lydia to use and without me to diminish, turned her energy fully onto Daniel, and Daniel, finally left alone with the full weight of his mother's control and no wife to absorb the overflow, he saw her clearly, maybe for the first time. He sent me a message. Long, honest, more honest than he'd been in years. He said he'd lost the best thing that had ever walked into his life because he hadn't had the courage to stand between me and the person who wanted me gone. He didn't ask for another chance. He just said he was sorry. I read it twice. I put my phone face down on my desk. I went back to work. Rochelle and I took that trip to Portugal I'd been putting off for 3 years. 3 years of Daniel doesn't really like flying long haul, and maybe next year. We booked it on a random Tuesday and left on a Friday. I stood on a rooftop in Lisbon as the sun went down over the water, a glass of wine in my hand, laughter coming out of me like something long stored and finally released. The wind moved through my locks, the city glowed below, and I felt, genuinely, fully felt, like myself. Like the woman my mother worked double shifts to raise. Like the woman who slept on a borrowed mattress and built something anyway. I hadn't lost. I had returned. I used to think that leaving meant failing, that walking away from a marriage meant I hadn't fought hard enough, loved well enough, bent far enough. But I want you to hear me clearly on this. I fought. I loved deeply and without reservation. I bent so far that I almost forgot my own shape. The failure was not mine. Some tables are not built with a seat for you, no matter how graciously you sit at the edge of them. And the most powerful thing you can ever do is stand up, fold your napkin, and go build your own. I packed my bags before the betrayal happened, not because I gave up, but because I finally believed I was worth more than what was being offered. That belief, that was the thing that saved me. Not the divorce, not the magazine spread, not the trip to Lisbon. The belief. The quiet, unshakable decision that I deserved better, made in the dark, on the edge of a bed, alone. If you are sitting in a version of the story I just told you, if you are smiling through dinners that diminish you, laughing off comments that cut you, waiting for someone to choose you the way you have already chosen them, I need you to hear this. You don't have to wait to be pushed out. You can walk out with your bags already packed, your head already high, and your whole life waiting on the other side of that door. If this story moved something in you, please give it a like and share it with someone who needs to hear it today. Subscribe so you never miss a story like this one, and drop a comment below.
At what moment would you have walked away? I want to read every single one. Because you being here, it means everything.